Pereira. India on Thursday sought to play down American President Donald Trump's remarks that New Delhi is not treating the US very well on the trade front, insisting that it was important to understand the context in which he made the comments. As hopes for sealing the much-anticipated trade deal during Trump's visit to India next week faded away, India said it does not want to create artificial deadlines. Meanwhile, the External Affairs spokesperson said that India-US relationship is progressing from strength to strength and that trade has already been growing at more than 10% per annum for the past 2 years. The US remains the top trading partner for India in terms of trade in goods and services, followed by China. While the bilateral trade between the US and India is approximately 62% in goods and 38% in services, the bilateral trade between India and China is dominated by goods. In our special telecast today, we will analyze India-US trade relations ahead of President Trump's visit. Joining me on the program today are Saurabh Chandra, former Secretary, DIPP, Ministry of Industry and Commerce, Government of India; Arun Kumar Singh, former Ambassador; and Rajan Sudesh Ratna, Economic Affairs Officer, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this special telecast. Arun Kumar Singh, let me begin the program with you first. Let's talk about the status of ties when we look at trade in particular between India and the United States.
So one, of course, as you said, the status of ties, if you look overall, has become fairly strong. Politically, the two countries do a lot together. Strategically, there is a lot of convergence, especially if you look at the region and if you look at what is described as the Indo-Pacific. In terms of defense cooperation, there has been tremendous progress. Till 2008, we had hardly bought any defense supplies from the US. Now we have contracted to buy almost $18 billion of defense supplies from the US. And as the latest reports show, another $3 billion worth of supplies are in the pipeline. So that's looking at the overall relationship. Now, if you just look at the trade relationship, in the last 15 years, trade has increased 10 times. So that is significant. And as you mentioned, US is India's largest trading partner. According to a comment made by the current Indian ambassador, the trade now stands at $160 billion and it's increasing by almost 10% every year. But what is significant is that India has a trade surplus with the United States. Our trade surplus with the US in 2018 was about $26 billion. Now it's about $21 billion. And at a time when we are an overall trade deficit country with the United States, we have a trade surplus. And if you look at another segment, the IT sector in India is very important for India. 9% of our GDP is generated by the information technology sector. Bulk of our production is exported. Bulk of our exports go to the United States. So the United States remains an important partner for India and a growing partner in terms of trade. And again, in the last 2 years, we have contracted to buy $7 billion worth of oil and gas from the United States, something that we had not been buying earlier. Of course, the US at the moment is generating some kind of concern, saying that India has a huge trade surplus with the US. India is among the 10 top countries with which US has a trade deficit. And the policy of the current administration, especially President Trump, is that he's looking at trade relationship with every country in the bilateral context and wants every trade surplus or deficit issue to be addressed. So he would like some more balancing here, which is different from the earlier norms when you are looking at the global picture. So I think that's where the two countries are now engaged in a very serious discussion in terms of what can India sell more to the United States, what can India buy more from the US, and that's the process that's going on.
Okay, all right. Talking about the progress now, Saurabh Chandra, how much progress do you believe we can make during this visit of President Donald Trump to India, and how much progress would be good progress as far as India is concerned?
These are long-term things. They can't be associated with one visit or the other. And the sentiment now is that a trade deal is going to wait at least until the elections. Now, there are many sticky issues, whether it's trade, tariffs, subsidies, data localization, intellectual property. Dairy sector is extremely sticky. We want them to import a lot more mangoes. So many things. Now, this will take time. intellectual property will remain a problem. Then the entire gamut of these agreements do not cover labor. H-1B visas is a very important issue. All this is going to take time.
Okay, it's going to take time. You can't expect things to change overnight, is what Saurabh Chandra is suggesting. Let me go across to Rajan Ratana now. As you know, as far as this issue of trade surplus is concerned, let's go back to that. Let's go back to the first speaker and the observations that he made. How do we address this issue of trade surplus? What needs to be done, or what does the president need to see India doing?
Well, what Ambassador Singh said has been a correct reflection of that. While with most of the trading partners, India has adverse balance of trade. But US being the topmost market destination, definitely India has a surplus in terms of the trade. Looking into the very traditional way, and that way even the thinking in India which is going on, which at least I don't think should be now realistic to evaluate a bilateral trade relationship in terms of balance of trade. Today you are talking about a global value chain. Today you are talking about a regional supply and a value chain. So when you look into only a balance of trade, you do not actually look into the real trade in terms of value added which is happening from one country to another country. Now let's look at, and I have some facts which I would like to share, good that Ambassador Singh told about. You know, in 2018, if you look at what is the topmost item in a sector which India exported to India, if you look from the harmonized system of nomenclature, it's a chapter 71, which is gems and jewelry, pearls, etc. Now, this is what our top sector to US. What did we import from US? It's the same chapter, chapter 71, which is number 1 import, which we imported from India. Now, if you look at the value, we exported $11 billion and we imported something around $7 billion. So, the $4 billion which has come in as a surplus. Now, is that all $4 billion which has gone from India? Is it all what the labor has gone, or value addition or gone, or these supplies would have come from, because if you talk about diamonds and other, it may have come from somewhere else for which India would have paid to another country, say Africa, for bringing diamond which is then polished and being sold to US. So, those factors need to be now taken into consideration. The another thing which I would like to point it out, it's a very historical visit of President Trump, because as Ambassador Singh said, India has the defense ties, but technology is another important. I mean, former Secretary talked about intellectual property. But technology is very important. India has been getting a lot of investments earlier coming in from US, which brought technology. Geopolitical, we know US and India. But one thing which I want to touch upon, and I think would be very important if in this visit there could be some ice breaking, is a multilateral process. Most of the time when the talks are being on, it's looking into the bilateral process and the trade war, etc. But there is something which is going on, a multilateral process in the WTO in Geneva. And Doha round, which came way back in 2001, is virtually dead. Nothing is moving. There is no consensus on what is the future roadmap. There have been G20 declarations. There have been declarations at various fora about moving it. And I think if Modi and Trump can devote some time on that process to bring it back, would be a very important part which can be played.
Okay. Ambassador, there have been confusing statements really as far as the president is concerned. Once he says that there is no trade deal on the table, and I'll have a mega trade deal sometime in the future. The next day he talks about maybe there could be a trade deal on the table, let's see how it goes. What can we expect really as far as trade is concerned? Do we take it as it comes along, or do we have some kind of a plan really? How do you prepare for this visit as far as trade is concerned?
So at the moment, the picture, as you mentioned, does appear a bit confused. There was a clear sign that both countries were making a very determined effort to reach some kind of what was described as a limited trade package. And obviously, it was not going to be a major trade deal, but some package where both would get market access. And for India, the important thing would be that GSP benefits for supplies from India would be restored. because the US has removed that as a pressure point on India. And again, India has been agreed that US has imposed tariffs on aluminium and steel supplies from India to the US, ostensibly on national security grounds, which they had invoked against China. And India's argument is that if we are a strategic partner for the US, how can you use national security grounds to invoke trade measures against India? It doesn't hold. And very recently, the US has taken away the developing country classification from India as far as the imposition of countervailing measures are concerned. So that again is going to be a challenge from India. So I think on trade related issues, it is clear that US continues to take a hard line and is trying to push the maximum advantage that it can get. All countries try and do that. And so although the two countries were engaged in negotiations, from the reports that are now coming out, it's a sense that US wanted to use the visit of President Trump to see what is the maximum they can get in terms of market access and other benefits for themselves. India was looking at reviving the GSP and some other market access gains. But eventually it reached a point that the two could not work out a satisfactory arrangement. And so that's where it is. It's quite clear that efforts will continue to some extent while the visit is still working out to see if something can emerge. And I think President Trump has protected himself by saying that a major trade deal is not going to happen now. Because even if something happens, and as of now the indications are that nothing seems to be on the cards, but even if something happens, that will be limited. And then that may be criticized as not being ambitious enough. And then, of course, you cover yourself by saying that in any case, a major deal will come later. So I think that's the game that is being played out. But more important, I think the signal from both sides is that even if a trade deal doesn't work out, because a lot of people will then start raising questions that if the trade deal hasn't worked out, is the relationship in trouble? So the signal is that even if a trade deal doesn't work out, discussions are going on, whether for a limited agreement or for a bigger agreement. And the other dimensions of the relationship, the defense, the strategic, the political, those are very important and those are continuing.
Talking about signals, I must ask you this question because, you're a former ambassador. So how do the diplomats really prepare to a visit like this when there are mixed and conflicting signals that are coming through from the other side?
I think, look, they would say, we certainly would say that they're conflicting signals from the US. And US would say they're conflicting signals from India, that, you say that it's a big relationship, why aren't you giving us more on trade and other things? So I think all visits have elements of the positive, elements on the challenges, because the way it works out, each government, each bureaucracy is dealing with many issues and many priorities. But when a high level visit is taking place, both systems then concentrate on issues relevant to the two countries. And both try to generate pressure on the other to extract the maximum for themselves. And so there is progress, some you're not able to progress. So it happens in each visit. And ultimately you have to see what is the maximum advantage that any country is able to get. Now, for example, you take a look at the visit of President Bush in 2006. The whole effort was to make some progress on the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. And it was done. And whether you look at visit of President Obama, 2010, 2015, again, there were frictions even at that time on trade issues. At 2010, I recall there was a big discussion on dairy. And there was a lot of frustration on the US side that India did not accept the demands they were making on dairy. And that continues to be an issue today. So I think that's not something unique to either this visit or just to the India-US relationship.
Okay, all right. Mr. Chandra? So let's talk about some of the opportunities then, really, as far as a trade is concerned. What do we need to focus on? What point do we need to drive home? And also, is Harley-Davidson still a factor now?
Harley-Davidson was only an example to put some pressure on India. But I think the area of cooperation is technology, as was mentioned earlier, artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, automation, telecommunications, and so on.
But how much of cutting-edge technology is the US willing to give away to India or to share with India, like some of the other countries, like the Israelis do, for instance?
No country really shares your cutting-edge technology, because manufacturing, the value addition comes only when you have depth in manufacturing, and that means that you own the intellectual property, you've done the R&D, now you're cashing it. So finally, when it comes down to the crunch, we will have to do our own R&D and build on it. China has actually done it. What they've done in 5G, it's something which is remarkable.
So that's a model for us also then, is what you're suggesting. All right, let me go across to Dr. Ratna as well. You know, as far as challenges are concerned, how do we address some of these challenges? What are some of the biggest challenges? What would we like to talk about to the visiting US delegation as far as some of these trade challenges are concerned?
Well, what I see, and the question which you ask, and Ambassador Singh also responded to, you know, there is a lot of work which is done before these VIPs arrive. So when he is coming now to 24th, but I think the diplomacy and diplomats from both sides and the technical level, they have been working, must have been working for more than a month on this. I see when Trump comes and what has been emerging into these VIP visits, there would definitely be some agreement. Mostly these will be non-controversial cooperation types. Whether they will substantially lead to economic linkage between India and US, or in technology or IP or artificial intelligence, that I don't know. But definitely there is going to be something which is expected, might come out. Now, when you look at these, and let's be realistic about what has been talked. Do you think Trump in this visit will come and announce that the withdrawal of GSP to India is restored without getting anything in return? That the duties on aluminum and iron and steel which has been imposed will be withdrawn? When US withdrew GSP, not GSP, when imposed way back aluminum and steel duties at par when it did for China, India also issued a custom notification for a retaliatory measure, but for a good 1 year and more, it did not implement. Every 2 months, 3 months, that notification was kept suspended. And then when US withdrew GSP last year, that was the time when actually in June, July, India really implemented that custom notification. And you could see the tweets, which is a very Trump-like tweets, where he said it's India is doing this and that. But as Ambassador Singh says, again, and if you go back to the basics, even imposition of these duties on aluminum and steel, and not only on India or China or anywhere else, it's under security exception, which is Article 21 of GATT, which unfortunately, if you ask the lawyers who have been looking into the trade law or economists, it's very rarely used. I mean, this is not very commonly used. The problem is, given its nature, and US lawyers, I would admit, are very smart. They knew that the WTO jurisprudence will not enter into interpreting use of this article, and so they are getting away with it. That is a reality. So in trade, in many of the cases, what we used to hear, might is right, and might here can play the way he or she wants to. US has, let's recognize the fact, I mean, China had to agree to what US wanted in terms of opening and giving the reciprocal market. So bilaterally, it's very difficult to negotiate any trade agreement with US where you would get on a full reciprocity the desired things. And as what has been said, US has very fixed position on certain things: e-commerce, data, right, intellectual property, environment, labor. Now these are the issues which I'm not sure whether India politically, economically or socially we are ready to make a firm commitment to US in trade agreements. And that's why I think it's more realistic when President Trump, before coming, he said, oh, the trade agreement, which is all comprehensive, will take time, maybe not before the next election. So he's also buying time. And let's be realistic about one fact. He also has a domestic constituency. His winning US election was on the pretext of, protectionism. And he has to live to that expectation of the Americans. So he cannot be seen to be delivering something to any other country, including India, which optically goes back to his constituency, showing that he has weakened his position from the traditional way he was. And that is a big dilemma as to how he is going to address that.
Absolutely. I think that's a very crucial point that you made there. His domestic audience and his eye or his mind is clearly on the election in November 2020. But taking the discussion forward now, Arun Kumar Singh, so with everything that's happening in China, with the Wuhan virus, coronavirus, whatever you want to call it, is that an opportunity really for India and the United States, maybe, going forward?
So one shouldn't look at taking advantage of another person or another country's problems as such, but at the same time...
But it's a genuine problem at the end of the day.
It's a genuine problem, and I think value chains are being disrupted. But aside from that, even if, let's say, China were not facing this particular problem, now the US under President Trump has signaled very clearly that it sees the problem from China in a different light compared to earlier administrations, and it wants to meet the technological challenge that China is posing to the United States. And therefore, to some extent, this is a problem that the US has created for itself, because in the 1990s, it was the United States that started the process of bringing China into the WTO. And once China entered the WTO, it took advantage of WTO rules and regulations to enhance market access for itself, to enhance manufacturing in China. And now the US is saying that China has benefited from the WTO norms but has not followed WTO norms in terms of industrial and trade practices. And so they are pushing back on that. And for example, they are canvassing with countries not to use Huawei for 5G technology. They're putting pressure on universities in the US, laboratories in the US, not to partner with Chinese entities. So the US industry is beginning to realize that going ahead, they perhaps for their own interests, not to have the same stake in China in terms of production as they've done so far, and they're trying to move out. But here again, as of today, 60% of those who moved out went back to the United States, and about 30% who moved out went to Vietnam and other countries, and very few have come into India. So we have to also examine as to what role do we want to play in the disrupted and the new value chain arrangements that are coming into place, whether we want to take advantage of that. And as Saurabh mentioned, we also need to focus on newer technology, because the new value chains would be created around 5G, artificial intelligence, data, quantum computing, convergence of biology and IT. So in those areas, and not just the existing production areas, we have to look at what are we going to do in India, how much do we need to do ourselves, and how much do we need to do as part of an integrated global value chain, and where is the opportunity there. So I think if that is mapped out clearly, and a very concerted effort made in India to take advantage of that process, and the decoupling to some extent that is happening between the United States and China in production processes, there will certainly be opportunity for India.
I think that's a very valid and an important point there being made. We need to set our house in order first if we have to ensure that we need to take advantage of what's happening internationally. All right, what's the best way forward then, Saurabh Chandra?
You see, lessons have to be learned from this Wuhan crisis. One is perhaps there was not a very accurate and detailed assessment of risks inherent in a global value chain. Concentrating manufacturing in one country. So the first lesson is, please, in the global value chain, a lot of nations will have to play a role in it. Now, what are the lessons for India? You become so dependent on active pharmaceutical ingredients from China that we have to revive the API manufacturing capacity in this country. I remember this was talked of about 7 years ago, and thereafter, because we've not been competitive, we continue to import a lot of API. Now this is it's a strategic choice. How do we get our API manufacturing back on the rails? It's a larger issue of getting manufacturing back on the rails. You need factory reforms, you need enablers, you need logistics, you need to address environmental concerns, and above all, reduce the regulatory burden to create a climate where private investment is willing to come. At the moment, private investment is an issue.
Right.
And we need to address that.
Sure, certainly. And Rajan Ratna, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think I won't see it as an opportunity for India. To be very honest, there are a lot of literary work which came even when US imposed trade sanctions against India. Definitely some countries benefited because of that, not India. And what is happening now in China, in India, we will face the consequences after 3 to 4 months from now. As Home Secretary is saying, pharmaceutical, we are totally dependent on China to source the bulk drugs. Now, if right now the Indian industry may be having stocks inventory, after 3 months, 4 months, if there is a deadlock like this, your whole chain, your whole supply to the world, which we are reining in, non-branded generic drugs, the demand would be there, but we would not be in a position to fulfill the requirement, and it will break the chain. So you are vulnerable, and definitely there are many things which we should have done at the home front, not now, not 10 years, but 20 years. Labor reforms, agriculture reforms, regulatory reforms. But this is a good time to do it. Sometimes, you bring reforms only when there are bigger shocks which come to the nation. If you look at when the global economic recession took place way back in 2008, India was not that affected as other countries were. And perhaps there was a confidence which was building into the industry and our own market, and brought some kind of a complacency. But the dependence of not only India, but many other countries is a reality now. You cannot live in isolation without that. And anything happens to China, you will be affected. And that is a lesson which we need to learn.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this special.